Here is Van Dieman's Eucalyptus. This would be a perfect bright summer type of green that isn't as dark in the writing sample as it is in the swatch. The tone is very consistent as we change papers, and while it can shade really well, it doesn't always show up as well as it could. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, the aggressiveness of this ink really stands out with the feathering, spreading, and how deep it gets into the paper. The aggression of this ink makes it a hard pass for me. It even manages to get into it deep into some of the premium papers.
The pen for today is a Pelikan M120. And now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how we got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Such a nice bright green that we're getting, especially on the white, bright white of this paper. No feathering, no spreading, a very nice shading. I said it can shade very well, and we really do see it here. Take a look at algebra on the first line, where the A is lighter than the LG, where the E gets very light. The bra at the end gets much darker. Looking at the back of the page, we can see a couple of spots where it did get very deep into the paper. Not to the point where it's going to bleed through and touch the page underneath, but these very dark points on Clairfontaine are a huge red flag for me for what's going on.
Van Dieman's makes more than just this one ink. So let's take a look at a few other inks from Van Dieman's.
Here is Van Dieman's Apricot. Here is Van Dieman's Beetroot Relish.
Here is Van Dieman's Midnight Sky. Here is Van Dieman's Tasmanian Saffron.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here we can see that we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. Now, it does have tiny little feathers that show up at certain moments. It does have the slightest bit of spread that's going on. Now, it does shade some, not as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, but some. The thing about it is, when it shades, it gets tiny feathers that are going on. So they both show up together. That's its own little bit of a problem. Looking at the back of the page, we can see a whole lot of spots where it got very deep into the paper. Now, not touching the page underneath, but maybe stopping you from writing back here. I don't know that it would or it wouldn't. But again, we get warning signs about some of the aggression of this ink.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here we can see that the tone is just a little bit lighter and brighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Now, that's probably a result of the toned paper, really mixing some of this yellowish tone in, making it into a brighter green, showing that this ink is a little translucent. It does have a little bit of feathers that you can see all over the place. It does have a slight bit of spread that's going on. It does shade. With that shading comes even more feathers. Looking at the back of the page, you can see a ton of spots where the ink gets very deep into the paper, never touching the page underneath, but getting very deep, possibly to the point of saying you don't want to write on the back of the page. The amount of ghosting, I don't know if I would write on the back of the page, but I might test it on a page to see how it would go.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, the smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we see that we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade, but nowhere near as good as it did on the Clairfontaine. It does stand out against the quad rule with no problems. Now, while I was calling it the same tone, it might appear to be a little bit lighter. That's only because we're not getting the darker areas of the darkest parts of the shading. We're only getting that majority mid of what it gets with some darker from there. It's just not as drastic a difference from its lightest to darkest tone with what we're seeing. Looking at the back of the page, very important to draw your attention to these spots that I don't know that they come through on camera, but I can see them. These are spots where the ink got very deep into this coated paper, warning signs of an aggressive ink. However, none of these spots bled through, touching the page underneath.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more green inks.
Here is Diatramensis Deepwater Obsession Black Green. Here is Mont Blanc Daniel Defoe. Here is Pelican 4001 Brilliant Green. Here is Sailor Epinard.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Here we can see that we get the same tones as the Clairfontaine. It's just a little bit flatter in delivery as a result of this paper. Now, it does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade fairly well. Fairly well. I want to take back some of them does not feather. I'm seeing little feathers here going on with the. Kind of surprising, but I'm not seeing it too much anywhere else. It shades not as well as on the Clairfontaine as far as frequently to as dark, but it does get as dark as it does on the Clairfontaine. Take a look at stand on the first line where the S is very light, the TA very dark, the N into the D a nice mid-tone, and the downstroke of that D becomes very dark again. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page.
Here is Pen BBS number 138. Here is Noodler's Concord Bream. Here is Noodler's Black. Here is Colorverse Redshift.
The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here we can see that the tone is just a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Now, it does have some tiny feathers going on that you can easily see in things like expression. You see it in the 1 of the 10. You see it in while. The feathering is not as common on this paper, which is the only reason that I take the time to point it out. The amount of spread that it has is fairly normal for being on copy paper. It does have minor bits of shading, but not as any kind of real standout quality. I do think you could use this. You would just need to make sure that you used a much drier pen, drier and finer, if this is the paper that you go for. Looking at the back of the page, you see that it does get fairly deep into the paper, fairly regularly, moderate amount of ghosting for this paper, nothing bled through touching the page underneath.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The wet medium nib of the Pelikan M120 really made the aggressiveness of this ink a big problem for me. Off camera, I tried it in a dry fine, and it did cut down on the aggressiveness, but also lightened the tone, but just slightly. The control over the aggressiveness, I would say go for a dry fine or a dry stub. Just avoid wet pens and avoid non-fountain pen friendly papers with this ink.